The message arrived on a Tuesday at 3:47 station time, routed through the standard galactic emergency frequency that every species in the cooperative monitored, and that nobody had used for anything significant in 11 years. Commander Dara West was the duty officer at Colonial Fleet Command when it came in. She read it twice, then called her superior, Admiral Quelindra, who arrived in the command center 12 minutes later still buttoning his uniform jacket, read the message once, and stood very still for a moment before he said anything. The message was from the Krath High Council. The Krath homeworld's primary star, designated Ks 7441 in the Colonial Survey database, was exhibiting destabilization signatures consistent with an accelerating luminosity increase. The Council's own astrophysicists had been monitoring the progression for 8 months. They had delayed the announcement because the models had initially suggested a manageable timeline. The revised models did not suggest a manageable timeline. The revised models gave 14 months before radiation output reached unsurvivable levels on the homeworld's surface. A 3 billion Krath, 14 months. The message requested whatever assistance the Galactic Cooperative could provide. Vare read it once more, then he said quietly to the empty command center, "Get me the Colonial Assembly." The Colonial Assembly met in emergency session 18 hours after the message arrived. 42 species represented. The chamber had the specific quality of a room full of people who had all read the same thing and were all waiting to see who spoke first. Ambassador Halindra Quelsar of the Velthari delegation spoke first. She was 70 years old and had been a diplomat for 40 of them, and she had the specific quality of someone who understood that the thing everyone was thinking needed to be said out loud before anything useful could happen. The Krath attacked human colonial settlements 17 years ago, she said. Without provocation, without warning, without declaration. 14 settlements burned, 412,000 humans killed in the initial assault. The subsequent war lasted 4 years and produced casualties on both sides that this assembly has documented in full. She looked around the chamber. The species now requesting our assistance is the species that began that war. The chamber was quiet. I am not saying this to argue against assistance, she continued. I am saying it because it is the context, and the context needs to be acknowledged before we proceed, not avoided. From the Human Delegations section, Colonial Assembly Representative Myra Bren stood. She was 53 years old, a former colony administrator from Rena's Landing, one of the 14 settlements that had burned. She had lost her brother in the first assault. The chamber waited. The Krath High Council has sent this message to every species in the cooperative, Bren said. Every species in this chamber has read it and is now looking at the human delegation. She paused. I understand why. Humanity has the largest evacuation fleet capacity in the cooperative. Humanity has the most experience with mass civilian transfer operations. And humanity is the species the Krath tried hardest to destroy. Another pause. The unspoken question in this chamber is whether humanity will help. She looked at the assembled delegates. The answer is yes, she said. The question I am here to discuss is the logistics. The response from the Galactic Cooperative was not uniform. 17 species offered ships. 9 offered resources. 11 offered nothing and said nothing. 3 sent formal communications expressing the position that the Krath situation was a consequence of their own historical behavior and that the cooperative had no obligation to intervene. The Drevak Collective sent a message directly to the Human Colonial Assembly that contained a single line. We are watching to see what you do. The human fleet began evacuation planning on Thursday, 41 hours after the message arrived. The planning was led by Fleet Admiral Quelindra, 61 years old, 35 years in colonial fleet operations. a man who had commanded the 3rd Human Fleet Group during the Krath War and who had lost 11 ships and their crews in the engagement at Rena's station. He stood in front of the operational planning team on Thursday morning and said, "We have 14 months and 3 billion people to move. Tell me what we need." What they needed was significant. The human fleet had 240 large-capacity transport vessels rated for mass civilian movement. The cooperative allies were contributing another 90, 330 ships total. At maximum capacity, a single transit cycle to the designated resettlement worlds and back took 6 weeks. 14 months was approximately 9 transit cycles. 9 cycles at maximum capacity produced a number that was close to 3 billion but not 3 billion. "We will need to increase capacity," Quelindra said, looking at the numbers. "Every ship we can retrofit for additional passenger load, every civilian transport we can requisition, every allied vessel we can negotiate into the operation." He looked at the planning team. "We will also need the Krath to cooperate with the boarding and transit protocols, which means we need someone to go to the Krath homeworld and have that conversation." The room absorbed this. "The Krath have not had direct human contact since the ceasefire," said Commander West, who had been assigned to the planning team after passing the initial message up the chain 4 days ago. "The ceasefire was negotiated through Velthari intermediaries. There has been no direct communication in 11 years. "There will be now," Quelindra said. "Who do we send?" They sent Tam Bren. He was 38 years old, a colonial diplomatic service officer who had spent the past 11 years specializing in post-conflict communication, the specific, difficult work of establishing functional dialogue between species that had recently been trying to destroy each other. He had been born on Rena's landing. He had been 7 years old when it burned. His mother had been Myra Bren, who had stood in the colonial assembly 3 days ago and said the answer is yes. He had not been consulted before she said it. He had watched the session recording 3 times. He landed on the Krath homeworld 11 days after the message arrived. The Krath were large. The briefings had described them as large, and the briefings were accurate in the way that briefings about physical scale were usually accurate and insufficient. They stood between 2 and 3 meters tall, bilaterally symmetrical, with a secondary set of upper limbs that were used primarily for fine manipulation, and that were currently in every Krath Tam encountered in the landing facility, held close to the body in what the briefings described as a submission posture. The Krath High Council representative who met him was named Vailker Drevaknor. He was old. The briefings estimated his age at approximately 140 years, which placed his birth before the war, before the assault, before the 14 settlements. He stood in the landing facility with the submission posture, and he looked at Tam Bren and he said, in the cooperative standard language that the Krath had been taught by Velthari intermediaries and had apparently practiced. "We did not expect humans to come." Tam said, "We didn't expect to be coming." He paused. "Here we are." Drevaknor looked at him for a long moment. His secondary limbs shifted slightly, not the submission posture anymore, something the briefings didn't have a category for. He said, "Why?" Tam had thought about this question on the transit. He had prepared several versions of an answer. He had discarded all of them on the approach because none of them were quite honest enough. "Because 3 billion people are going to die if we don't come," he said. "And we don't do that. We killed 400,000 of your people." "Oh yes." "We burned your settlements." "Oh yes." "Why does that not change your answer?" Tam looked at him. "It changes a lot of things," he said. "It doesn't change that one." The first transit convoy departed human space 93 days after the initial message. 40 ships, human crews with Velthari and Quelindran observers aboard as cooperative witnesses. Quelindra had insisted on the observers not because he needed supervision, but because he understood that what humanity was doing needed witnesses, needed a record, needed the galaxy watching in an official capacity rather than just watching. The Drevak Collective was watching. They had sent a single observation vessel that maintained a parallel course with the convoy at a distance of approximately 2,000 kilometers. It did not communicate, it observed. Commander West was aboard the lead transport, Quelindra's Promise, a vessel rated for 12,000 passengers that had been retrofitted to carry 18,000. She had requested the assignment. Quelindra had approved it without comment. The approach to the Krath homeworld took 9 days. From 200,000 kilometers out, the star was visible in a way it should not have been too bright at the edges, the specific brightness of a process that was accelerating beyond its normal parameters. The briefings had described it. The description was accurate and insufficient. "It's faster than the models predicted," said the Quelindra's Promise's chief science officer, Dr. Sira Noor, looking at the stellar data. "The 14-month estimate may be optimistic." West looked at the data. How optimistic? Possibly by 2 months. 12 months instead of 14. The difference in the evacuation math was not trivial. West sent the updated assessment to Fleet Command and continued the approach. The boarding began on a Tuesday. Tam had spent the intervening 93 days on the Krath homeworld, working with Drevak Noor and the High Council on the boarding protocols. This had been the most difficult work of his diplomatic career, and his diplomatic career had not been without difficult work. The difficulty was not hostility. The Krath were not hostile. The difficulty was fear. 3 billion beings who had spent 11 years being told by their own government's propaganda, by the cultural residue of a war they had started and lost, that humans were something specific and specific in the direction of dangerous, who had heard the ceasefire terms read and had understood from the terms that humanity had been in a position to demand far more than it had demanded, who had been living for 11 years, with the knowledge of what they had done and the uncertainty of what consequences might still be coming. And now the humans were coming with ships. "They think we're here for revenge," Tam told Drevak Noor 6 weeks before the convoy arrived. He had learned to read the Krath's secondary limb positions well enough by then to know when he was receiving an honest response. "Some of them, yes," the old Krath said. "How many?" "Enough that the boarding will be difficult." "What do they need to see?" Drevak Noor considered this for a long time. "They need to see that the humans who come are not afraid of them." Tam's thought about this. "We're not afraid of you." "I know," Drevak Noor said, "they don't." The boarding protocols they developed together over those 6 weeks were built around this specific understanding. Human crew members on boarding ramps. No weapons visible, not because Quelindra had ordered weapons stowed, but because Tam had requested it and Quelindra had agreed. No protective barriers between human crew and Krath passengers. The specific deliberate vulnerability of a species that was not performing fearlessness but genuinely did not require the barriers. On the first day of boarding, Commander West stood at the base of the Quelindra's Promise's primary loading ramp. She had chosen to stand there personally, visibly, for the first 12 hours of boarding. She was not the largest human on the ship. She was not armed. She was simply present at the base of the ramp helping Krath board. The first Krath to board was a female. The Krath had 3 biological categories, the briefings noted, and the word female was the closest cooperative standard approximation. Approximately 2 meters tall, with 2 young offspring close against her body in the specific protective posture of a parent who was frightened and was not letting the fear reach the children. She stopped at the base of the ramp. She looked at West. West said in the Krath phrase Tam had taught her and that she had practiced for 2 weeks, "You are welcome here." The Krath female looked at her for a long moment. Her secondary limbs were in the submission posture. Then slowly they shifted, not submission, something else, something the briefings didn't have a category for either. She boarded. The first transit cycle took 6 weeks each way, 12 weeks total per cycle. The resettlement worlds, 3 of them, identified by Colonial Survey as habitable and unoccupied, allocated by the Colonial Assembly in a session that had taken 4 days of negotiation, were 11 days from the Krath homeworld at standard transit speed. By the end of the second transit cycle, the operation had a rhythm. Human ships ran continuous rotations. Crew rest cycles were compressed to the minimum safe duration. The retrofit capacity increases were holding. The engineering teams had found additional modifications that pushed the per-ship passenger load higher than the initial estimates. The Allied ships were performing at or above their committed capacity. The Krath were boarding faster than projected. The fear had not disappeared. Tam reported from the homeworld that it was still present in specific populations, specific regions, specific demographics that the propaganda had reached deepest. But it was decreasing. Word was moving through the Krath population at a speed that Tam found remarkable, not official communication, not government messaging, personal communication, the specific organic spread of information between people who trusted each other more than they trusted official channels. The information spreading was, the humans are not afraid of us, and they are not here for what we thought they were here for. And in the specific transmission that Tam documented in his field notes as the most significant thing he observed in 14 months on the Krath homeworld, they came because they said they would and they did not have to. By the 4th transit cycle, Krath families were approaching human crew members on the loading ramps. Not in the submission posture. In something that Tam had begun to characterize carefully as approach, the specific Krath posture of choosing to be near someone rather than being required to be near them. A Krath child young, the briefings described the developmental stage as approximately equivalent to a 6-year-old human, approached Commander West on the loading ramp on the 14th day of the 4th cycle's boarding. The child's secondary limbs were extended, not submission, not approach, something West did not have a category for. She crouched down to the child's level. The child touched her hand, briefly the lightest contact, and withdrew. West did not move. The child's parent, male, secondary limbs in the approach posture, said something in Krath. Tam, standing 6 meters away, translated it later from the recording. She wanted to know if you were real. West stood up. She looked at the parent. She said in the Krath phrase she had been using for 4 months, "You are welcome here." The parent's secondary limbs shifted into something Tam had not documented before and had to create a new notation for. His best translation, gratitude that costs the giver something. The observation vessel from the Drevak Collective had been maintaining its parallel course for 4 months when it sent its first communication. The message came to Quelindra's flagship on a Thursday. He read it and called West and read it to her over the comm. The message said, "We have been observing the operation for 122 days. We have transmitted our observations to our governing council. Our council has a question for the Human Colonial Assembly. The question is, why?" Quelindra said they want to know why. West said everyone wants to know why. What do I tell them? West thought about the Krath female at the base of the ramp on the first day of boarding. She thought about the child touching her hand. She thought about her mother standing in the Colonial Assembly and saying the answer is yes before anyone had asked the question. "Tell them what my mother said," she said. "Tell them 3 billion people were going to die and we don't do that. They'll ask why that's the answer." I know. West looked out the viewport at the convoy, 40 ships running in formation, human crews, Krath passengers, 6 weeks of transit ahead. Tell them we're still working out the full explanation. Tell them what we're doing is the answer and the explanation will catch up eventually. Quelindra was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a diplomatic answer." "It's an honest one." "Oh, he's sent it." The Drevak Collective's response came 4 days later. It contained one line, Our council has decided to contribute 12 vessels to the remaining transit cycles. The ninth transit cycle completed 4 days before the stellar radiation reached unsurvivable levels. The final count was 2,947,000,000 Krath evacuated. 53 million had refused evacuation, some from specific cultural and religious convictions about dying on the homeworld, some from fear that had not been reached in 14 months, some for reasons that Tam documented carefully and did not fully understand and filed in his report as requiring further study. On the last day before the radiation threshold, Tam stood on the Krath homeworld surface with Drevak Nor. The star was visibly wrong now, too bright, the specific sickly brightness of a process going wrong. The sky had a color it should not have had. Drevak Nor was 144 years old. He had refused evacuation. He had told Tam 3 months earlier that he would refuse. Tam had not argued. He had understood from 14 months on the homeworld that this was a decision that belonged entirely to Drevak Nor and that attempting to change it would be a specific kind of disrespect that the old Krath would not forgive. I want to tell you something, Drevak Nor said. His cooperative standard had improved significantly over 14 months of daily conversation with Tam. Before you go. Tam said, tell me. When I was young before the war, long before, there was a concept in Krath philosophy. He paused, finding the words. The concept described the specific shame of a debt that cannot be repaid, not the shame of owing, the specific additional shame of owing to someone you have harmed. The concept held that such a debt was the worst possible position because the harm cannot be undone and the debt cannot be repaid, and you must carry both indefinitely. He looked at the star. Your people have given us something worse than that debt, he said. We harmed you, you saved us anyway, we cannot repay it, we cannot undo the harm, we carry both. He paused. In our philosophy, this was considered the worst possible position. Tam waited. I have been thinking about it for 14 months, Drevak Nor said. I think our philosophy was wrong. I think the worst possible position is the one we were in before your ships came. The debt is heavy, the alternative was extinction. He looked at Tam. Tell your people I cannot make them understand the weight of it, but tell them we feel it. Tam said, I'll tell them. He boarded his shuttle 2 hours before the radiation threshold. The last thing he saw before the shuttle's viewport closed on the Krath homeworld was Drevak Nor, standing on the landing platform, secondary limbs in the posture Tam had spent 14 months learning to read. The notation he had created for it, gratitude that costs the giver something. He wrote it in his field notes one more time. The Colonial Assembly received the final operation report 6 weeks after the last transit cycle completed. Admiral Quelindra presented it in person. He stood at the front of the chamber and he read the final numbers: ships deployed, transit cycles completed, Krath evacuated, human crew hours logged, allied contributions, total operational cost, and then he set the report down and said, I want to add something that is not in the formal figures. The chamber waited. I have been in colonial fleet operations for 35 years, he said. I commanded ships in the Krath War, I lost crews in the Krath War. I accepted the ceasefire terms because they were the right terms and because continuing the war beyond those terms would have cost more than it returned. He paused. When the evacuation message arrived, I was asked to lead the operational planning. I want to be honest about what I thought when I read the message. The chamber was very still. I thought we don't have to do this, he said. We have the capacity. We are the only species with the capacity to do it at this scale, but we do not have an obligation. The Krath have no claim on us. The cooperative has no enforcement mechanism for this kind of response. We could have read the message and sent our condolences and let it go. He looked at the assembled delegates. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. We chose this. Nobody required it. Nobody could have required it. He picked up the report. The Drevak Collective contributed 12 vessels to the final 6 transit cycles. The Quelindran Alliance contributed 23 vessels across the full operation. 14 other species contributed resources, personnel, or logistical support. He looked up. At the beginning of this operation, 3 species sent formal communications expressing the position that the Krath situation was a consequence of their own historical behavior. All 3 of those species contributed to the operation before it was complete. He set the report down again. The galaxy watched what we did, he said. I think it is worth saying for the record what we did and why. We evacuated a species that had attacked us because 3 billion people were going to die, and we do not let 3 billion people die. Not because we owe them, not because the cooperative required it, because that is what we do. He paused. I think it matters that the records say so clearly. Representative Myra Bren from the human delegation said, "So noted." The resettlement worlds were called, in the Cooperative Standard Designation, RSW-1 through RSW-3. The Krath began calling them in their own language, something that Tam translated in his final report as, "the worlds the humans found for us." The translation note he added said, "In Krath the phrasing is more specific than this English rendering suggests. The word translated as found carries the connotation of found and prepared and gave. The Krath linguistic construction implies active gift rather than passive discovery." On RSW-2, in the settlement that grew largest and fastest, the Krath built something in the central plaza in the first year of resettlement. Tam was present when they built it. He documented it and sent the documentation to West and to Quelindra and to his mother. It was a statue. Not of a Krath figure. A human figure small by Krath standards, unremarkable in size, standing at the base of a loading ramp with one hand extended. The inscription at the base was in Krath. Tam translated it. "You are welcome here." Commander West received the photograph of the statue on a Thursday. She looked at it for a long time. Then she sent it to Tam with a single message. "Did you tell them about the statues?" He wrote back, "I didn't have to. They figured it out themselves." She looked at the photograph again, the human figure at the base of the ramp, the hand extended, the inscription. Outside her office viewport, a human colonial station ran its ordinary operations. Ships docking and departing, crew on rotation. The specific functional hum of a civilization that had spent 14 months running an evacuation operation and had returned to ordinary operations without particular ceremony, because that was also what they did. The Drevak Collective had sent a final message to the Colonial Assembly after the operation completed. It had been read into the official record. West had read it twice. It said, "We observed the full operation. We have no category in our diplomatic framework for what we observed. We are creating one. We will call it by the human word. We asked why. You said you do not let 3 billion people die. We have been in the cooperative for 200 years. We have not encountered this principle before. We are considering adopting it. We wanted you to know." She printed the message and put it on her desk next to the photograph. The hand extended, the inscription. "You are welcome here." The station hummed. The ships came and went. Somewhere in the resettlement worlds, 3 billion Krath were building something from what was left, new settlements, new communities, the specific difficult work of starting again on worlds that were not home, and that would become home because there was no alternative, and because that was what living things did. And in the central plaza of the largest settlement, a small human figure stood at the base of a loading ramp with one hand extended, in permanent stone, on a world that humans had found and prepared and given. The galaxy had watched. The galaxy had seen what humans did when they did not have to. Some of it was still deciding what to do with what it had seen. The humans had gone back to work.